talked about some of this stuff before, but what if I told you there was a revolving door between the people making the policy for lockdowns, mandates, and cures, and the ones selling the products for the lockdowns, mandates, and cures? What if the private sector that was and still is making billions of dollars and the government who is doling it out were actually the same people? Would you be surprised? Would you be concerned? I sure am. Now, a new study by Harvard and the University of California, Southern California, pretty much confirms all of my fears on this, revealing that over half of CDC employees end up working in the pharmaceutical industry immediately after leaving. At HHS, the people who dictated almost all of the COVID policy, according to Axios of all places, quote, 1/3 of political appointees to the Department of Health and Human Services go to work for the industry they oversaw immediately after departing their government job. Wow. Really? So now are you starting to see why they scooped up so much power and why they held onto it so tightly? And why so much money flowed in the industry, despite them being wrong about nearly everything? Again, according to the same article in Axios, the door swings in the other direction too. Quote, nearly 15% of HHS appointees were in private industry immediately before joining the department between 2004 and 2020. Again, shocking that this is not on the front page of every single newspaper everywhere. These people all talk to each other. This is how it goes. Hey, Pharma Company 1, I'm getting to the end of my 2-year resume-boosting political appointment at HHS. We have some no-bid contracts coming down the pipeline that I think your company may be able to hire and fulfill. How about you hire me? I'll direct them and, send them your way, and I can manage them for you when I get there. Like, it's not that concise, but that's basically how it goes. I saw this on many levels when I was a political appointee myself, and I did my best to squash all these contracts. But it's like whack-a-mole. They just keep popping up everywhere. I'm sure if some of you at home are probably thinking, like, how could that be? That'd be corruption and maybe fraud. Well, you'd be right. But it still happens. Don't believe me? Look at this. In the year 2020, according to NPR, again, quote, the U.S. government granted contracts worth as much as $25 billion as it races to address the COVID-19 public health crisis. Now, NPR reviewed a database of thousands of contractors' actions and found more than 250 companies that got contracts worth more than $1 million without going through a competitive bidding process. What? By 2021, the Government Accountability Office found that number had ballooned to over $61 billion on independent COVID contracts for anything ranging from PPE, tracking software, which is really crazy to me, and the ever-ambiguous consulting. There was a lot of that. Many of these contracts were issued with no prior business history with the federal government. None. Zero. Some of which were entirely new companies. And that doesn't even scratch the surface of the trillions of dollars exchanged over COVID. In fact, COVID may have been the greatest wealth transfer in the history of America. Or the world. Forbes even noting an entire spread on it. Quote, meet the 40 new billionaires who got rich fighting COVID-19. End quote. Hundreds of billions of dollars flowed into a handful of companies post-vaccine release. And for crying out loud, just 2 of these companies made over $50 billion combined last year alone. And that was after the federal investment from all the vaccine research. But this is just the latest example of all this. Look, this happens all the time. It happens in the defense industry, too. In fact, the Pentagon is probably the longest perpetuator of this. The Department of Defense, that gets almost $1 trillion a year in their annual budget, it's like $800 billion sometimes, has never passed an audit. And just last year, the Pentagon admitted to not being able to account for $2 trillion in assets again. Maybe this is not the first time it's happened with the Pentagon. They just use the fear of safety to do it. Sound familiar? COVID was the vehicle to usher in a new lane of power and wealth transfers. And it's been a long time coming. Look at this. According to the LA Times, before COVID even happened, quote, since the 1930s, the National Institutes of Health has invested close to $900 billion in basic applied research that formed both the pharmaceutical and biotechnology sectors, with private companies only getting seriously into the biotech game in the 1980s. That number exploded after 2019. And Big Pharma, it's not letting up. They're using that revolving door that I just talked about to keep the fear spending going like an ATM. Now, according to a group, ironically enough, called the Revolving Door Project, it actually tracks, among other things, the amount of money used in lobbying across industries. It's actually not a conservative group. The quote, the industry's desire to influence government policy is not limited to the legislative branch. Between 1998 and 2021, lobbyists for Big Pharma at large spent $4.7 billion with a B dollars lobbying politicians, more than any other sector. Now, just for comparison here, that is over 10 times as much as the financial lobbyist and the oil industry lobbyist combined. 10 times. And you know what the craziest thing among all this is? All the money spent and all the mandates pushed and the garbage science, many of these places, government or private sector specifically, when it comes to COVID, have zero liability. None. Nothing at all. And no recourse to refund us if their product doesn't work. You mad yet? I am.